Okay, so what we're going to do class is a continuation of what we did in the previous class, and that is to look at ways that you can lay out your page using CSS. And again, the sort of idea of this is being able to take the wireframe that you create and create a web page from it. So we're going to look at all kinds of techniques that will sort of do that. And I'm doing that by showing you some prototypes. Let me make sure that you sort of understand how this process would work. Because all these things labeled prototype would be an acceptable prototype to turn in. I mean, not turn mine in, obviously, but something like that. So like, for example, prototype 1. It has the home page, the navigation, the links. And a couple of the links work. But notice what's different between this and the completed site. For one thing, not all the links work. That's okay in a prototype. If you were showing this to someone, you would know not to click on those links, and you'd tell them, hey, only the first 3 links work. You would also tell them, hey, that the text here is not actual text that's going to appear on the page. If you had images, they might not be the exact images that you'd use, and so on. So prototypes should look like the finished site, like I would expect, to use this background, to use this layout, to use this navigation, but it doesn't have to have all the content of the finished site. So it should look like the site, not all the content. It's acceptable to use this Greek text in a prototype. It's not acceptable to use it in a finished project. So we have 3 of them. Now, how did I go and do this? Because if you notice, these 3 pages look identical other than this section of code here. Well, what I did in creating this is I created a page called template.html. So I went in here and I created a page called template.html. And I created the style sheet to go with it. So I got this as close to the way I wanted it to look as possible. So I got this having the look, the navigation, the way that I wanted it to be. And this template consists of 2 distinct pieces of content. One of them is stuff that's going to appear on every page. For example, Zeller's Guide to Vacation Destinations, this navigation, this footer. Those are going to appear on every page. I'm going to pay special attention that I get those correct. Because in a minute here, after I've gotten my template correct, I'm going to clone that template over a few different times. And I want to make sure that I get it correct so that I don't have to go back and change it. Now, this middle section is going to be different for each page. So in this middle section, Hawaii and Iceland, this section is going to look different, as well as the home page. But the basic, these 3 pieces, the header, the footer, and the navigation, are going to look the same. So I'm going to try to make sure I got those exactly the way I want. I'm not going to be too concerned about the details of CSS because it's in one place and one place only. Like if I look at this and say, I wish the text was a little bigger on this. Well, because I've used an external CSS file, I can go and make that change to it, and it will change all the pages. So let's say I want the H1 to be a little bit bigger. So I say font size 2M. Then if I refresh the template, Already at 2 EM. Yeah, there we go. I can make it a little smaller or a little bigger or whatever. Okay, so once I got my template the way I want it to, and again, without worrying about the little details of stuff that's in the CSS, because that I can always change because all that code is concentrated only in one file. But once I have this template HTML correct, I'm going to clone it for each of these, and I don't want to make changes to all my clones. I want to make changes while I'm planning it and creating the template. So if I wanted to create the Brazil page, for example, I would simply copy this, rename it, and then I would go in and I would change that middle section stuff in that middle section here to be stuff about Brazil. So in other words, creating 10 pages doesn't take you 10 times as long as creating one page, because you're going to create your template and you're going to clone it as many times as you need to. And you're only going to change the portion of the page that is different in all cases. So in this case, I would have now my prototype for Brazil. All right. If I'm not mistaken, we went over this last time. Let me look at the CSS to see if there was anything I missed, or if we covered it all. All right, we talked about the background image. It was actually a small image that we tile. For you to view this in Paint, it's only a small square, but the way the square is set up, it's set up to tile so that it forms this interlocking pattern when you put a bunch of these squares next to each other. Header, we have a width of 600 pixels. That's an absolute size. And this is good for our first example, but we're going to avoid those absolute sizes. We're going to use percentage sizes instead. The page changes its width. That doesn't get any bigger or smaller. Margin is the space between this thing and other things. So we have 0px on the top and bottom. Remember how these goes? Top, right, bottom, left. Auto means to center it. Padding is 15 pixels. That's the space between the text and the edge of the container. Background white, text align center, that centers this guy. Border solid, black 2px, and we're given a radius, and that gives the curve. The higher the number, the more the curve. So if I were to change this to 10px, it would be more rectangular and less round. Remember, when we define a font, we give separate or several font types, because on any given machine they may or may not have a particular font installed. So I say Garamond serif. What that means is the browser will first try to display using the Garamond font. If that is not available, it will use the standard serif font. All browsers have a standard serif and sans serif font. The serif is with the little things on the end of the letters, like if you look here at the Z, the little hitch at the end. Sans serif is without that. Like, for example, the L is a sans serif font. List style type none. I don't think we talked about last time. What that does is that removes the bullet points from my unordered list. If we look at this, and we'll look at the Brazil page, but all the rest of them are the same. My links are in an unordered list. That's what I suggested way back when we started covering navigation and links, to have your links in an unordered list. But notice that there are no bullet points next to these. Typically, if there was no CSS, this would be a bulleted list. But what I've said here, and watch, I'm going to go to Hawaii instead. I've said a UL in the navigation section gets this style rule. So we're going to start doing more with selectors. If you remember when we talked about this before, selectors say what gets the particular style rule. And like in this case, body, header, H1, for example. That means every H1 on the page, wherever it appears. If we do our selector like this, it's saying only the ULs within the navigation section. So if we look at the Hawaii page, you'll notice that there are two unordered lists. The navigation's in an unordered list, and there's an unordered list at the top of the content, but they look very different. Why? Well, because I've specified a different style rule for the ones that are in the navigation section. And the list style type is the little dot that appears next to it. And in our case, I said I wanted none. So that puts no bullet point in front of the items. I've also said the LI, the display is inline, but that's only for LIs within the nav section. All right, I said display is inline, margin left of 4 pixels. Now let's look at see what this means, display of inline. There's two kinds of tags in HTML. There's block and then there's inline tags. A block tag is where you have a new line every time you start a block tag. So for example, a paragraph is a block tag. When we're done with this paragraph and we start the next paragraph, it starts on a new line. New paragraph starts on a new line, and so on. Inline tags would be something like this. I have a paragraph, and I say background image from, and I specify the link. Might be a little hard to see down there, but there it is. That link is on the same line as the text before it. So block means the text starts on a new line. Inline means it starts in line with the text that comes, the stuff that came before it. So I've made those LIs in line. What that means is they're not going to stack on top of each other vertically. They're going to go like this. So this is getting to what I was saying before, how just about anything on a page, we can change the way the browser displays it. So the default behavior for a browser is to make ULs be a bulleted list. But this is also a UL. All right, it's also a list of items. but we're displaying it not as a bulleted list. We're displaying it as a set of links that appear alongside of each other to form sort of a navigation bar. And we've given a margin on the left of 4 pixels. What if I make it bigger? Let's make it smaller. Margin on the left 1 pixel. Well, that'll move everything closer together. Margin on the left, 8 pixels. And makes them wider spread apart. So there's no top margin, there's no right margin, no bottom margin, but there's 4 spaces between this link and the previous link. All right, now let's look at the style for the links themselves. And the one thing one feedback that I had on a lot of students' assignments, which were, by the way, overall very good. I'm not lying when I say I enjoy grading your stuff, because grading your stuff is is visually interesting. It looks good. If I'm grading, say, a Java program, that can be a little dry. All right. Not that it's bad, but it's just not as exciting as grading people's web pages. But the one thing that I saw many people do is they have made their links. They've made their background color, let's say purple. And they don't do anything with their links. They don't style their links. So by default, what do you get? You get a blue link by default. That's what a link is colored. You get a blue link on a purple background, and that can be difficult to read. So on a lot of people's assignments, I've said, hey, your links are hard to read. All right. Well, how do you fix that? Well, one would be to change your background color, right? Don't make it purple, make it yellow instead. But another way to do it would be to change the color of your links. So these links, I've given a font size of 0.8 EM. So the text in the links are a little smaller than the default link size. The border is 1 pixel solid black. So there's a 1 pixel solid black, and border radius is 3 pixels. That means I have a little rounded rectangle. Let me zoom in so you can see it better. Little rounded rectangle is each of the links. Padding is 3 pixels, which means that from the border to where the text starts, there are 3 pixels. Text decoration, none. That gets rid of the underline under a link. Because again, what we do with CSS is we change the default behavior of the browser. Now, by default, links are blue and are underlined. So in this case, we have our buttons. That clearly indicates to people, hey, this is probably a link, right? On other pages, the underline indicates that it's a link. But we've given some cue that, hey, this is a link. So that people can look at it and they can easily determine that this is our navigation, all right? And again, by default, it's going to be underlines. We don't want underlines, so we say text decoration of none. And I've given a background color of blue. Oh, I'm sorry, a text color of blue and a background of a shade of gray. Pound sign CC, CC, CC. So that's how these links look like this. Now, there's several other ways to style a link. Specifically, links in a certain state on the page. And these are officially called pseudo classes. And there is a pseudo class for there's a link, there's hover, there's visited, and then there's active. So what I've done is I haven't done anything for visited and active. But instead I've said nav a:hover. What that means is when the user's mouse is hovering over that link, I'm going to change the background color to blue and the color of the text to white. So we sort of flip it over. That gives a second visual cue that, hey, this is a link. Now we could do a lot of stuff with this. We could actually make the text size smaller. Or I'm sorry, bigger. Well, we could do bigger or smaller, but bigger would probably make more sense. Font size 1.1 pm. And it makes it bigger. We're not doing these things just to have fun. Well, sometimes we do it just to have fun, but we're mainly doing it to give users a good idea of what this stuff means, right? We have a border around the navigation because we don't want the navigation to blend in with the rest of the stuff on the page. So we put a border around it. That sets it apart. Likewise with the footer and the header. We want these things to stand out as being separate pieces. So therefore we put borders around them. The links we want to stand out. So therefore we do a special styling for them and do even more special styling when the user hovers their link over on top of it. Now I could put visited here. And I'm going to make the background same as for a regular link. What is complaining about? What's this in? Well, I can make maybe the color magenta. Now notice those links appear as magenta because they've been visited already by me. That's a useful tool to have on the website. This is really a design decision that you make. Choices like you can show people what links they visited. That way they might keep them from accidentally going and retracing their steps. Or it might help them like, gee, I remember one of the vacation spots had something cool I wanted to try. Well, let's see. It must be one of these three because those are the ones that I visited. The other thing is active. And active always confuses me. I think active is when it has focus. I'm using the we can find a better definition of active. I rarely use active, so that's why I'm. Oh. Active kicks in right as you're clicking it. So as I going here, as I go and click it, it changes the color. So you can do that. But those are the 4 things you can do with links: hover, visited, and active, plus the regular style. This is important, and try to get some creativity with it. And creativity, not just for creativity's sake, but creativity to really make your link stand out on the page, especially in your navigation section. One of the worst things as far as design goes for web pages to me is if I go to a web page and I can't tell what the navigation is. Now, fortunately, there's not a lot of pages that are like that, but there are some where you look at it and say, where do I even begin? What is the main navigation of this page? Whereas if you do something in the styling to make the navigation section really stand out, then it really assists the user. All right. I think I went over how to create a Google font family last time. There's a place that generates the code and gives you this link that you can put in your code, and then you can use it in your style sheet. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to look at are different kinds of selectors. Because if you look at this web page, you'll notice that this is red. And it's not just red, it's bold. All right. Now, that's just a paragraph. We already have a style rule in here to say what paragraphs look like, I think. Actually don't. But we could have a style to say what a paragraph looks like. But that style, in fact, let's do that. Let's make it a dark shade of gray instead of black. Not that dark. Okay. So it's not quite black. It's a little less harsh on the eye, but it's still very readable. And that's a lot of times what I like to do when I'm doing websites is I won't do a font color as black. I'll do it as some shade of gray because I don't know, that seems easier to read to me. But you know, your mileage may vary. So I put a style rule for the paragraph, but this paragraph has a different style rule. All right. How does that work? Well, this selector again is an HTML selector. It says apply to everything on the page that is a paragraph tag, apply this style rule, which it did. But I have this thing called .important. Notice it begins with a dot. Not important is a class style rule. In other words, it doesn't appear on any specific HTML tag, but when we say class equals to, that's what associates that style rule with this paragraph. So if you look at a page, you could have all sorts of classes of text, classes of paragraphs or whatever. You could have stuff that's important. Think of pharmaceutical company, you know, if they're on their website, they might have the side effects of their medicines. They might have, I don't know, something else about their medicines. A restaurant may have directions to the restaurant. All right, might have menu items, might have nutritional information. So there's different classes of stuff that you can put on the page. And what you can do is you can put classes on those paragraphs or headings or whatever you want to give them a certain style rule, to give them a certain appearance. So anything on this page that has a class of important is going to get this style rule. Font weight is going to be bold and the color is going to be red. Now, you can have many things on the page with the same class. For example, if I look and I think this item is important, I can go into the code and I could put on the LI, class equals important. Maybe some reason that is a more important item in my list. Right, and that becomes that style. So the thing with classes to remember is, you know, how many people belong to a certain category or a certain class of people. Like, you know, there are graduate students and regular students. There are, you know, there's adjunct professors and there's full-time professors. Think of the code the same way. Your code belongs to different classes of code, and you can assign multiple things the same class. So that's a way that you get something to look different than the rest of the page. So this allowed us to get this paragraph to look different than the other paragraphs on the page. Now, interesting thing is cascading style sheets cascade, which means that this paragraph still gets the size of 1.1 because it is a paragraph. But since it's a paragraph with the class important, we overrule the color, overrule the default font weight. Now, if you notice way in the footer here, we have an ID of credits. All right, an ID of credits. The difference between an ID and class is there should only be one thing on the page for a given ID. But there can be multiple things on the page for a given class. Students are often confused, like, when do I use one versus the other? And there's only going to be one section of the page that has credits. All right, I'm not going to have credits in two different places. Therefore, I can give an ID and say ID equals credits. And then I specify the style rule this way. So by credits, I can make the credits have a smaller font size, and I can say every A within something with an ID of credits gets a style rule. Gives the link a color red. So if you notice, this A tag, this link, is inside a paragraph with the ID of credits, therefore it gets the style rule. So let's take inventory about what we know about selectors now. What we knew going into this class, or going into this section of lectures, is that we can have style rules based on the HTML tag. Whereas everything with this HTML tag gets the style rule. Because that's what a selector is. It says what gets this style rule. So we have HTML tags, first of all. Second thing we have is we have stuff inside of other stuff. So I can say this nav UL means only ULs inside the nav section get the style rule. This other UL that is outside the navigation doesn't get the style rule. But ULs within the nav section get the style rule. And notice, no dots or hashtags in front of this. Therefore, that refers to an HTML tag. This means any LI tag within the nav section. This means any A within the nav section. We've learned about these pseudo classes that allow you to define different styles for different states of links. And again, how many of them you use is up to you. You can use all 4 of them, or you can just pick a couple of them to use. They all have their advantages to them. We've learned about classes, because we can assign different items on our HTML page classes, and they get the style rules defined by dot and the name of the class. So class of important gets the style rule defined in dot important. Finally, with IDs, it's with the # or hashtag, and things with that ID get the particular style rule. And we can do just like we did before, containment. In other words, A's within something that has an ID of credits. Difference between IDs and classes is an ID is unique, whereas classes can be used multiple times. All right, this is prototype 1. What I've done is I've taken this and I've created multiple versions of the site using different CSS. So this is the same website using different CSS. Now in this one, the only difference I believe is I've made it a relative size. In other words, I didn't give it 600 pixels. I've made it a certain percentage. And generally speaking, these are preferred because they conform then to the size of the page. So let's look at the style rule. I've specified a width. Instead of a certain number of pixels, I've specified the width in percentages. And I've also given a minimum width, which means it will not get smaller than this. That's useful sometimes because if you don't have a minimum width, sometimes the page looks weird or ugly. Let's get rid of minimum width on the navigation. Because if you notice, the navigation is a nice line the whole time. But if I get rid of the minimum width on navigation, looks fine, but as it gets smaller, it starts overlapping like that. And I don't necessarily want that. So a lot of times with style rules, things get goofy if the page gets too small. So you can, the cure to that is by putting a minimum width. So it's 75% of the page, but don't get any smaller than 550 pixels or whatever. Other than that, that's the only difference, I believe, between style 1 and style 2. Prototype 1 and prototype 2. Did I mention in this class CSS Zen Gardens? Does that ring a bell? What I'm attempting to do with this is to do something a little bit like they do on the website CSS Zen Gardens. And CSS Zen Gardens it's not active anymore. You say it if they took it down, because I always use it as an example. Oh, there we go. They take the same web page and they style it a bunch of different ways. So here's the default size or the default appearance of it. This is the same web page, but styled differently. This is the same web page, but styled differently. Now, the people who have done this are professional designers, you know, that only do graphic design, you know, and are, you know, the best in their field. But we can do that, and we can aspire to this level of code by giving two different looks of the same web page. A number of your assignments, at least some coming up, have asked you to create two versions of the same page. And that's what we're doing here. So in other words, this page and this page are the exact same HTML. Even though they behave very differently and look very differently. And that's what happens when you have a good separation between your HTML and CSS code. So you don't do anything dealing with the appearance in HTML. All your stuff relating to appearance is in the CSS file. So what I've tried to do with this, and what I hope you do with your assignments, is to try to make your pages look as different as possible, but keeping the exact same HTML code. All right, are there any questions? Either here or online? Okay, two of these are down. We'll go over a few more of these next time. You can get a jump start on that if you want to by looking at some of these designs. There's an example of one. And so on. So if there are no further questions, we will either see you next week or in lab. All right, take care.